All right, we'll go ahead and I guess get started here. I know there's a break after this, so I don't want to hold people too much up from that. It's been a long day and a long week already, right? So as the title suggests, this is going to be lessons learned by the federal government to elevate your zero trust implementation. And yeah, I'm going to abuse zero trust, even though Matt Topper in the last session said, please stop using it. We're going to have fun, don't worry. So who am I? I'm Bryan Rosensteel. I'm with Ping Identity. I've got a whole bunch of different titles. Just think of me as Ping's resident U.S. federal nut / policy, I don't know, crazy person. And this comes from pretty much spending my whole career in or around the federal government, and specifically 12 years of that career within federal identity, credential, and access management. We call that FICAM. Yeah, I speak in acronyms and letters and numbers, and I love it, and I'll try to translate where I can. So today, we're just going to try to do three things in the time I have before they kick me off the stage. That's going to be just answering one, is the federal government really innovative? Two, what's different about the government's identity practices? Why should we even care? And three, how is the government moving to that buzzword, right? Zero trust. Well, let's go ahead and get right into it. And you know what? The doors are still open, so let's get that elephant or that monkey or whatever animal that we need to kick out of the room, let's kick it out of the room. Let's actually address how the government is typically viewed. And I'm not talking about the Hollywood interpretation here, right? The, what is it like, I don't know, the holographic computers that we see with Tony Stark or Minority Report or CSI. No. I'm actually saying if I went through and asked you how you actually view the federal government, you'd probably give me some central themes. You'd tell me they're incredibly slow to adopt modern technology. You'd probably point out they're super inefficient. In fact, if you might crack a joke like the most efficient thing the government is their efficiency and inefficiency, and all right, there might be some validity there. And you'd probably go in and say, if you're really clever, you know, they've got huge shortages in budget, especially when it comes to things like IT modernization. Sure, spend a ton of money on unbreakable, you know, ashtrays, but when it comes to actually modernizing the IT, that's been stuck in continuing resolutions just over and over for the last decade. You may even point out a fourth one. You might talk about overwhelming regulation. And you might even start bringing up a whole bunch of those letters and numbers that I hold so dear, right? HSPD 12 and FIPS 201 and FIPS 140 and special publications like 157 or 171 or 53, and I can go on, and trust me, like I get really giddy and like excited about that stuff. And when, you know, 63, the revision 4 comes out, I'm going to read it as soon as it comes out because I love that stuff. But most people will look at this and say, why does this pertain to me? Why do I need to pay attention? And quite honestly, it's just really confusing. But it's worth researching. It's worth taking a little bit of the time. In fact, speaking of research, I think there's one up here even I need to get familiar with, and that's Jenny's Law, otherwise known as 8675309. So, why should we pay attention to the government? Well, quite honestly, I don't think I've done the greatest job so far of convincing you. So, all right, let's reset. Let's take a step back. Let's maybe be a little bit more serious, and let's look at what the government has to actually do on a day-to-day basis. So the federal government, and I don't speak in absolutes, but I'm about to. They're the most attacked infrastructure around. When you actually think about what they have to deal with, it's not Matthew Broderick who just wants to go in and play a chess game with a computer. It's advanced persistent threats. It's, you know, nation-state level attacks. It's state-sponsored threat actors coming in today, tomorrow, next week, the following week, again and again and again. Why? Because they want to get to the crown jewels within the federal government. Think about some of the information that they house and they have to protect. And you know what? Sure, the government misses occasionally, and we're going to talk about a couple of those misses during this presentation. But for the most part, they get it right. And they do it time and time again. And that alone, I think, is worth paying attention to how they're doing this. Because it's not just some, you know, a couple of computers cobbled together in a basement, although I've been to a few of those sites. It's really incredibly large, diverse, geographically dispersed infrastructures. You know what? I'm going to give you an example. We're going to talk about the United States Department of Agriculture. Yeah, USDA, those people who they put the little gratings to make sure that your burger tastes good. We're going to talk about them. Why? You may not realize this, but the USDA has an office location in every single county in these United States. Every single county in every single state has an office for the USDA. Think about that. Think how many other organizations can make that claim. And of course, we're just talking about what's happening in the States. When we start talking about some of the missions that go abroad globally, how are they doing this? How are they remaining interconnected? And how are they standing up to these threats we just talked about? And last, and I've kind of hinted at this, the government has diverse use cases. And yeah, not just like the really crazy missions that are super fun to kind of go into. I'm actually talking about the way they physically go out and deploy their infrastructure. The federal government, like everyone else, they have already moved and are continuing to move to the cloud environments. This is where you'll hear about things like FedRAMP. But they also have to have continuity of operations. They have to be able to have true hybrid infrastructure where they operate on-premise. They don't have this luxury where if the internet connectivity goes down, they could fail open or fail closed. They simply can't fail because some of their mission statements are that important. And they also have things called air-gapped. They have environments that have no external connectivity, and yet they have to maintain mission excellence. In fact, you know, eventually, I'm expecting the federal government to come to me and say, hey, Bryan, I've got to do strong authentication, I've got to do strong authorization in this data center. And you know what, for fun, I'm going to make this data center mobile because I can. I want it to move around. And you know, we're going to have even more fun with it. I want to really explore this ability to have disconnected communications whenever I want and not knowing when it's going to come back. And I'm going to make it really air-gapped, not just theoretical, but let's make it operate under the ocean. Because that'd be really cool. I mean, leave it up to the government. I'm sure they'll figure out some way to do something like that, but who knows? So maybe I've done a better job of convincing you that there's some validity to what the government's doing. There's some extreme use cases that they have to go through. So let's explore how they're approaching zero trust, how they're going about this. And that journey, well, that journey actually started a long time ago. It started way before any of us had, you know, way too much time on our hands and we were locked inside during COVID and we just started researching buzzwords. It actually started back in the last century. In fact, I can wind the clock all the way back to some of the earliest days of computers, when we started realizing the sensitivities of computer programs themselves, knowing that we need to restrict access. One of the very first computer programs ever written is classified to this day. Probably never will be unclassified. And that's because that computer program was written to help create the atomic bomb. Atomic bombs and computers, they grew up together. So let's fast forward. Let's go into around the 80s when Al Gore was inventing the internet. And we had different nodes that we connected together, and we had, you know, kind of clear communication going through, right? Unencrypted communication. And Bob decides he wants to have some fun and go in and start tampering with messages. Well, we start realizing we need to have password-connected communications. We need to have a way of having some type of verification, some type of trust in that message, and that it's still what the originator intended. Some of these words just start sounding familiar. They're very zero trusty. Now, I'm going to bring the clock up to something a little bit closer, only about 2 decades ago in the early 2000s. And in that time frame is really when we see kind of modern IT infrastructure, in my opinion, taking root in the federal government. This is with the rise of secure, reliable identification. This is where we start seeing enterprise-grade multi-factor authentication really being stressed in importance. And yeah, I'm talking about things like the PIV card. I'm talking about X509 certificate authentication. The reason for this comes from one of the areas where the government got it wrong. So the government had a lot of silos, and we're going to talk about silos and how bad they are a little bit later. But agencies had multiple different identity systems. They had no way of actually trusting who went through what and how to even verify this stuff, and there was a lot of disconnected communication as a result. So during this time, 2 very tragic events occur. These events really drive home to the federal government the importance of having this secure, reliable identification. And yeah, I'm alluding to both 9/11 and Hurricane Katrina. So we know we had to do better. We start investing in this secure multi-factor authentication. We're marrying it to really strong identity assurance. And this paves the way for the government to start moving into passwordless as well. They've been on that journey for well over a decade, even a decade and a half. Now we fast forward to the last decade, to the teens. I'm going to start using teens and 20s and 30s because it's going to be fun. And we get to the rise of digital identity risk management. What are we talking about? We're talking about knowing that we have a problem. We've got another major miss by the federal government, right? They get it wrong again. And they've got over-provisioned accounts. They've got too much ability for lateral spread, and we see major attacks of infiltrations, just massive exfiltrations of data as a result. We're talking about insider threats, we're talking about external threat actors. Specifically, think of WikiLeaks. Think of, from an external threat actor, think of the OPM breach. And I want to highlight OPM for just a second. It's the Office of Personnel Management. That breach from an external threat actor, it was a state-sponsored attack, saw the release of information around everyone who had a clearance within the federal government. Now, for those of us who had a clearance, that may not have been a big of a deal because we sign up for that when we go into work every single day. But on that data was also our friends and family. So I had to call up my friends and family, say, hey, I'm really sorry. Your information is now in the hands of an adversary. Just please be a little bit more cautious. This also happens because on these forms, what else is on there? Addresses. And this is a true story. Federal agents had to go and knock on a couple doors. They knocked on these doors and they said, sir, ma'am, I'm really sorry. Your family's at risk. Because see, your address is listed on this form that belongs to this individual who's on a terrorist top 100 hit list. And now your address is a terrorist target. See, when the government gets it wrong, it's not just about a loss of monetary. It's not just a loss of data or production. And yeah, they deal with that too. But they also deal with things that are a little bit more sensitive and literally in some situations deals with life and death scenarios. So the federal government says we got to do better. We have to stop with this over-provisioning. We've got to figure out ways of isolating, right? We start talking about microsegmentations. We start talking about access controls in a better way. We start really talking about this thing called ABAC, Attribute-Based Access Control. By the way, that's NIST Special Publication 800-162, if you're curious. We start seeing that arise as we also start hearing about zero trust becoming a topic. And that leads us into today. And I've got phishing-resistant MFA up on here, but we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But what the federal government is doing is this roadmap has led into zero trust all along the way, reinforcing based upon hard lessons learned, and now the government is all in on it. But before we talk about how, let's go back and review. During that kind of review history lesson, which I did a terrible job and went extremely fast through, we saw constant topics. Need for integrations, need for interoperability. And for those of you in the back who can't see, this down here talks about investments, continuous investments. Millions of dollars, billions of dollars in some cases of investments into IT modernization. Talk about a really big R&D budget that your organization may not have. Be really cool to ride on the coattails of that, right? Might be worth paying attention to. So, how is the federal government actually going about the zero trust strategy? Well, that comes in an EO 14028, which is a really fascinating document. Wait, sorry, I'm talking in numbers and letters again. The boring title is Executive Order on Improving the Nation's Cybersecurity. Trust me, EO 14028 rolls off the tongue a lot better. So what that is, comes out a year ago, comes out in May of 2021. The current administration says enough is enough. We can't talk about these things in terms of best practices. It must be not only policy, it must be the letter of the law. It must be a way that we can enforce it, and we've got to do better. And anyone dealing with federal data now has to abide by this. By the way, I didn't just say the executive branch. I didn't even say the federal government. I said anyone dealing with federal data. Your organization, if you're in critical infrastructure, if you're in any way engaged with the government, you probably fall under this executive order. You should probably be familiar with it. Now, over the past year, policy nuts like myself have just been scrambling to keep up because we've seen a ton of release of executive orders, of policy documents coming out of OPM, of guidance out of NIST. And we're going to talk about one of them. One of the, I think, the most important documents that have come out, especially from an identity perspective, in my entire career, let alone the last 2 decades. And that is OMB Memorandum 22.9. If you remember no other acronyms from this, please remember Memorandum 22.9, because it's a big one. Yeah, all right, boring title, Moving the U.S. Government Towards Zero Trust Cybersecurity Principles. What is this document? Well, this is where the federal government defined each of the different pillars of zero trust with specific action items that the government must follow. This makes zero trust official U.S. government policy and tells the federal government how they're going to implement it. Now, within identity, and oh, by the way, This is kind of a cool thing for identity nuts like myself. The very first pillar and the very first action items that they identify are in identity. They identify 3 of them. First, agencies must employ centralized identity management systems for agency users. Second, agencies must use strong MFA throughout their enterprise. And third, when authorizing users to access resources, agencies must consider at least one device-level signal. Clear as mud, right? Everyone understands what they're getting to here? Don't worry, we're going to take a couple minutes and go through these because it's that important. Now, I'll be honest with you, I could have chosen any one of these 3 and said, hey, I want to do an entire presentation on it, and still not have had enough time to do it. So we're absolutely going to butcher it and run right through, but I'm going to try to show you why the federal government chose these 3 for identity. So the very first, employ centralized identity management. This is really talking about 2 things. It's talking about moving away from the applications doing authentication and authorizations decisions. So for those of you who were here for Matt's talk and he was pleading, hey, we need to do things through federation, this is what they're talking about. Why are they talking about that? Well, honestly, if you've got hundreds of applications, thousands of applications, and you need to be able to have adaptive authentication, if you need to have a dynamic authorization and you need to be able to respond to emerging threats, it is administratively near impossible. Again, I don't speak in absolutes, but it's pretty much impossible to do it when everything has to be done at the application. And this is another area where the federal government struggled. Why? Because they try to do PIV authentication, X509 authentication, at every single application endpoint. We call that PK enablement. It's an old school term and it's still around, and I would love nothing more than to kill it. So how do we do that? Doing centralized identity management. Now, there's another thing, and I've left it on the slide for a reason, and that's about breaking down identity silos. See, I promised to talk about silos. Why? Because most organizations are struggling with this, will continue to struggle with it, and you find me a mature enterprise, and I can probably find you an identity silo. And they are a juicy target for adversaries. And I'm going to give you a real-world example, and this one isn't necessarily in the federal government, but it's in critical infrastructure. And yeah, I'm talking about Colonial Pipeline. Why? Well, a lot of people point out that in Colonial, we had an administrative account that got phished, right on a legacy VPN, and it was just username and password. There's no MFA. So everyone says, if only they had MFA. And sure, that's true, but the real problem with it is when they said that account had been deprecated for use months in advance. That is the signature, that is the hallmark of an identity silo. If they had had something like a master user record where they had a centralized identity repository, and I'm not saying that you have to stand down all directories, but you have a centralized way of enforcing policy, that account never should have been active. That attack vector should never have been there, MFA or not. No, by the way, this is a great way to actually enforce MFA across your entire enterprise. If they had a master user record, people on the East Coast where I live wouldn't have had to go with garbage bags and fill them up with gasoline. That's what identity silos cause. So, by the way, I don't exactly know how that works, because I think gasoline actually eats trash bags. So anyway, it's neither here nor there. Moving on. Second one, using strong MFA throughout the enterprise. What are they talking about here? Well, not all multi-factor authentication is phishing resistant. Not all MFA is created equal. I cannot stress this enough. Why? Well, let's actually go through some common MFAs that you'll hear about, right? SMS OTP, I'm coming back to that sucker. Email OTP, the little hard tokens, right? And for administrators, they'll have like 4 or 5 of them. We call them shark's tooth necklaces, right? Even the push authenticators on a mobile device that a lot of us love to use because it's super easy, where you click to approve, every single one of them, and I can't give you any details, have been either directly breached, phished, bypassed, and organizations have been compromised who had those in use. They just aren't strong enough to certain sophistications of attacks. Now, there are time and places for some of those authenticators. However, SMS OTP, please kill it. Do not use it. It's just not secure. So the federal government is doubling down. They said, look, we've got 2 decades of investment in an incredibly strong authenticator that's phishing resistant in X509, in the PIV, in the CAC. And we also know FIDO's out there, and we know FIDO's phishing resistant, and we need to use it. But there's a problem with these. They struggle throughout the enterprise if we go application by application. So the federal government is investing today in making phishing-resistant authenticators work across the entire enterprise. We're getting concepts like derived FIDO starting to bubble up. We're talking about how do we shift away from application by application and instead, and this is especially true for FIDO, rather than having the end user have to register against all of these, register against that centralized identity management system. That allows us to make this a lot more scalable, a lot more usable. And that third one is considering device-level signals. This is the one that was probably the most confusing in that initial deck. And I'll be honest, every time I read this title, it's a little bit strange. What are they really talking about? They're talking about shifting away from RBAC to ABAC. So RBAC is role-based access control. And today, if you're doing authorizations, and please do authorizations, you're probably doing RBAC. It means like Bryan Rosensteel, he's a member of Ping Identity, he's on the federal team. Maybe in this case, I'm an administrator, therefore I have this particular level of access. Role-based access control. Now, I'm not saying this is bad. This is great. Like I said, this is an awesome start for authorizations. However, it's not enough. Why? Because we have to look past this. The government is saying, consider device-level signals. Orchestrate into your authentication flow this ability of looking into your endpoint protections, right? Your EMMs, your MDMs, whatever acronym we want to call it today. Bring those decisions into the process. Take a look at what's going on with user behavior analytics, right? UEBA. Let's take a look at other things that we have. Maybe we've got some risk engines or some AI engines. Let's be able to incorporate those in. So now, it's Bryan Rosensteel from Ping Identity. In this case, I'm an administrator in the federal part of our business. But in addition, I'm coming in from a corporate-owned laptop. In addition, I'm coming in a way that we expect, from a region of a country that we expect, from a browser that we expect, from a network that we expect, right? I can look at all of these together. I'm marrying in static attributes from a directory and contextual attributes based upon the way I'm interacting with the system in order to be able to determine, based upon the sensitivity of the resource I am requesting, whether or not I should be granted access, or whether or not I need to do something like step-up authentication. That's what the government is saying you need to do. To me, from an identity perspective, and again, I'm really biased on it, this is kind of where you want to be with zero trust. And the federal government says this isn't like a coulda, woulda, shoulda. This is required. This is the law. And they're going to be investing heavily to be able to do this. So, in summary, what are our key takeaways? Well, hopefully, if we go back to my 3 questions, if we ask ourselves, is the federal government really innovative? We will say, yes, they are innovative. And all those crazy regulations that make me giddy, they document the way the federal government is going about this. They might be worth consideration. They might be worth reading and familiarizing yourself, even if you aren't directly impacted by them. Second, what's different about the government's identity practices? Well, they're doing some extreme scenarios and supporting some extreme use cases. They have to make sure the right user is accessing the right resource at the right time for the right reasons, for the right federal business objectives. I believe I've almost exactly got the FICAM definition correct when I said that. And the third, how is the government moving to zero trust? Well, it's that OMB Memorandum 22.9. So it's 3 things that we talked about from an identity perspective. It's about the centralization of your ICAM system. It's about doing that strong multi-factor authentication. It's about how all of us are going to kill SMS OTP, yes. And it's about how we're going to move into ABAC. So in conclusion, yeah, I really do feel the federal government is a strong identity resource. Use it to your advantage. Thank you very much.
We have time for about 1 or 2 questions.
As I was going to say, I know we're right up against the break too, so I will take absolutely no offense.
Yep, thank you. So as a fellow policy nerd,
Nice.
Have you found any place where phishing resistant is actually defined?
So I had a conversation about that last night, and the term phishing resistant is something, well, I mean, I'm a fisherman at heart, so I love it, but like everyone else hates it. It's about verifier kind of person, like they're working on a better definition, I actually expect in 63.4, in that thing I got giddy about. All right, so I'll translate. NIST Special Publication 863 is the digital identity guidelines that the federal government defines. It's where they'll define different levels of assurance, that's an old school term, for identity proofing, for authenticators, and for federation. And in the new revision, I'm hoping they actually address to make that more clear. But the concept of it is that we're not only do you have to have a strong authenticator that meets certain cryptographic requirements, but additionally, the user has to be interacting with the device that the authentication is going through. So that's where we get into where we split hairs about those authenticators on the mobile device, the push authentication, because you can actually do that while sitting and watching Netflix instead of being down by your computer. And that absolutely is what users do. They get those requests and they just click approve. So, but no, you're absolutely right to kind of point it out. That term is still a little bit evolving and in flux. So, any other questions?
Talk to us about FIDO-derived.
Okay, so repeat it. Yeah. So the question was about FIDO-derived, or I'm going to flip it around because policy nut, derived FIDO. What we're talking about is, so the federal government has got a ton of policies and implementations in place to say the identity proofing and binding process, including like almost promising your firstborn in order to be able to get a PIV. So that has already occurred. What the federal government doesn't want to do when they implement other authenticators is have to put the users back through that. It takes a full day of the user's time. It's months of background investigation that goes into it. So can we bootstrap that authentication that's already happened and has resulted in something like a PIV or a CAC and use that to issue another credential? They've already done it today in something called a derived PIV, but now we're looking at, and we're really kind of solutioning out, something called a derived FIDO credential. How do I take an existing authenticator, and if you don't have a PIV, it could be something else your organization has. How can I take that, bootstrap off its trust, and issue myself this new authenticator such that we then identify, so it's not just about authenticating, but actually identify in the authentication that we pass through the federation, this credential is of this type of FIDO authenticator at this level of trust with this type of identity proofing and binding behind it. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about derived FIDO. And if you want to know more about it, follow ATARC. I actually just wrote a call to action for FIDO vendors to come in and demonstrate, what the art of the possible is. And I'm getting some good feedback on it. So we expect that to come out. Hopefully we officially release it in about a week or so. And we expect to see those demonstrations towards the end of the month. Or not end of this month, I'm sorry, end of July at the earliest. So, any other questions?
Will some of that work also be within the Zero Trust Lab at the NCCOE?
So the NCCOE hasn't necessarily reached out yet for it, but I expect they would. So I worked with the NCCOE when we did with the original iteration of 157 is derived PIV. And I expect when 157 revision 2 hits the street, they're going to want to see derived FIDO. I hope they do, and I imagine they would. But that probably will lag behind ATARC by a considerable amount, considering that 157, that draft hasn't been released yet. But yeah, I hope they do. So.
Bryan, define NCCOE.
National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence. Thank you. NIST recognizes they can't write policy in a vacuum. So they have a lab environment. It's based out of, I think, Bethesda or Rockville over in Maryland. And this lab, what they do, this is actually really important because they seek to try to put NIST guidance into action and see, okay, how close can we do it with commercial off-the-shelf COTS technologies? By the way, they're going through right now a zero trust lab, and they aren't doing it for federal. So a lot of times people think, well, NCCOE and NIST, that's only federal. Actually, no, their target audience for this is commercial environment. They actually said, we want to make sure that we can do something where it's not just in the federal silo, but is more universal. So NIST, NCCOE, they're worth paying attention to. They got all kinds of different building blocks is what they call them. They even do things with like first responders. And then ATARC, Advanced Technology Academic Research Center, is a government kind of fronted, if you will. It's not actually a government organization, but they seek to help kind of influence and show what's possible for the federal government. So, cool. Well, hey, thank you very much. You've got a break now, so go off, enjoy it. You've sure earned it, and I hope you enjoy the conference.